So recording is starting. So hello everybody. Thanks for joining us in this third day of streaming streams. Today it's me, Salvatore de Rosa, postdoc at KTH, having a conversation with Professor Julie Z. I hope it's correct, Z. So Professor Julie Z is a professor of American Studies and founding director of the Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Davis. Her book, Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice from MIT Press, won the 2008 John Hope Franklin Publication Prize. And their second book, Fantasy Islands, Chinese Dreams and Ecological Fears in the Age of Climate Crisis, was published in 2015. The most recent book that we will discuss in this conversation is Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger from UC Press, and was published early in 2020. Her research investigates environmental justice and environmental inequalities, particularly focusing on the nexus between environments and culture, race, gender, and power, and with a keen interest in community health and community activism, especially in urban areas. So thank you very much for joining us, Julie.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I would like to start from a key question that you bring up in your new book. So the question is, what can be learned from environmental justice movements in a moment of danger? Intuitively, it certainly seems we are living through a moment that we could define very dangerous in many ways, both on a global scale and in myriads of local contexts. So I would like to start by asking you first, how would you define the current danger or dangers that we are living through? And secondly, why do you think environmental justice perspectives and activism could be relevant in this conjuncture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are very many moments of dangerous times that we're living through. Of course, this book was written and researched before the pandemic started, but the pandemic reveals a lot of the dangers that the book already talks about. In terms of the fears of the book, the dangers are about how the struggles that are happening in the environmental sphere are completely connected to climate crises and the rise of authoritarianism on a global scale. And so, of course, I write from the U.S. and I try to talk about the U.S. within a global context. And I think in the U.S. it's very easy to just focus on Trump and his attacks on not just the environment, but also immigrants and refugees and labor protections, gender equality, the whole host of issues that left people care about. And so what I try to do is talk about his authoritarianism and his authoritarian populism within a global context. And so I think what the biggest danger that we have now is that the forces he represents are not particular to the U.S. They're global. They're taking place in India, Brazil, Hungary, etc. And so if we need to, I write from the U.S. and a lot of the U.S.-centered politics around environmental justice, but try to place it within a global framework. And so therefore, if we see the problems as connected, we can also see the movements as they are also connected. And so I think one of the things we can learn from environmental justice movements is to think about how the justice movements are themselves making connections across space and issues. And that's the biggest lesson of environmental justice, is that truism that everything is connected, that environmental and social inequalities are connected, and therefore labor and environmental protections are connected. That's the most powerful lesson that we can take from environmental justice movements. whether it's based in the US or in terms of forest defenders who pay with their lives in Latin America. And so what I try to do in the book is outline how all of these problems are connected, but then also think about the broader scale other than the moment we're living in, which is a very traumatizing and dangerous moment on many different issues.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the also central features that seems emerging from your analysis of environmental justice movements is the issue of solidarity, also that informs this movement and also participate in this work of connection and connecting. But do you also see it? You also see solidarity playing out in the US context in this current moment of pandemic, in the instances of grassroots politics, but also in the resurgence of Black resistance. And in particular, do you see a connection between the legacy and solidarity building of environmental justice movements contributing to contemporary struggles against police violence and also authoritarian management of the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why it's important. You're absolutely right. One of the main takeaways from the book that I try to talk about is how the justice movements themselves are always building solidarity and making connections all the time. That's one of the most important things that justice movements do. And so that you can't, judge a movement just by the policy impact in a short-term way, but think about how what they're contributing is a long-term framework of understanding the world. And so justice movements, they're one of their biggest contributions is in terms of changing what is available in terms of the imaginative sphere. And so in terms of the specific examples, in the first chapter of my book, I talk about Standing Rock and the indigenous struggles across the Americas around oil and pipelines. And in that case, a lot of the solidarity that was built on the pipelines was around policing and violence against protesters and how protest itself gets policed. And so, you can see that at Standing Rock when police dogs from private contractors were set upon the protesters, when the water cannons and so on. And so I think there was a very conscious link between the policing at Standing Rock and thinking about, how that's tied to, policing in urban spaces and the criminalization of certain kinds of behaviors and so on. And so in another example of how policing and environmental justice gets linked, I talk about, I can't remember in this book or not, but how a lot of the policing and the police deaths of African Americans and basically crimes of poverty in the US-based cities, that a lot of that way it gets policed can be found exemplified by Eric Garner, who was killed by the police in New York. And what he said was, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And that's exactly what George Floyd said in Minneapolis. And of course, George Floyd, we know, was already, he had COVID and he had already lost his job. So he was vulnerable, before the moment where the police murdered him. And the New York Times did this incredible overview of, have been over 70 police deaths, probably more, where the person who was murdered said, I can't breathe, because of the policing tactics. And so, I think that what justice activists do, environmental justice, anti-police violence activists do, is talk about the way in which the condition of life gets choked out of you, and that could be, it's not just a metaphor, it's a material reality, whether it's on the individual level of a windpipe, being crushed by, what what Reverend Sharpton said at George Floyd's funeral when he said, get your knee off my neck. It could be on an individual level, or it could be on a more social scale, which is, what happens around oil pipelines and at Standing Rock, or in places like the Central Valley, or in Flint, Michigan, or after any of the, horrific hurricanes that happen and the after effects of them. So, these are all examples that I talk about in the book. So New Orleans to Maria and so on. And so that idea of like the knee on your neck, is both individual but also social, and very much impacted in the US context by race or indigenous dispossession.
And it seems that the answer to this need, like the way to lift this weight from communities and individuals, should be rooted in solidarity.
Yes.
And it seems also to me that the work of solidarity building really has a lot of connection, like it throws something in the future, in the sense that it creates a base from which then other movements can grow. And I'm thinking specifically in Italy. We have seen during the pandemic crisis how a lot of social infrastructure and social networks created by movements active on environmental issues or social issues have been immediately repurposed to offer mutual help for all those people that suddenly became unemployed and poor and could not afford even food. So I think this is something you point to, how solidarity creates a legacy that then informs future struggles and creates the resources for future movement to rise. But still, one very challenging task that also runs through your book and your work, as we were saying before, is the work of connection that the environmental justice movement try to put forward. And I would say even more difficult sometimes is the linking with the broader society. Like how to overcome lines of racial, socioeconomic, cultural, and historical separations among people that have been built or reinforced throughout national histories, and the deep divisions within US society testify precisely that. So in this regard, I mean, how do you see can the work of connection that movements bring forward help to overcome separations that play out in the social and environmental struggles you have also investigated? So, I mean, the real question is how much can we hope to build a very broad societal base for progressive and justice politics? Or maybe shall we come to the terms that as movements, we should also learn how to defend ourselves, because there are parts of society that will never join us. And I'm thinking, for example, to right-wing extremists or racist mobs or even state forces.
Well, I think that, there will always be forces that will not join us. But I think, I'm not a political analyst, and so, I can't, say what number, what percentage of people you need, to be on either side. But I think, if you just look at the US context, and bringing up the defund the police and the, abolition movement in the US, after George Floyd's killing, there's been a huge number of sustained actions and police protests that have been taking place and continue to take place, 100+ days after his murder. And, that work has been built upon. It doesn't, come out of a vacuum. It comes from the years of organizing and, struggles that community and justice organizers have been building, and so that was the spark, that lit a fire. And there have been policy gains and policy movements. But if you look at the polling data, there's been a remarkable shift in the number of people who are open to even thinking about defunding the police, or moving resources around, or thinking about what do police do, and why are they, why do they receive so many material resources when everything else has been privatized and cut to the bone, and austerity politics in the U.S. And so I think there's always going to be some proportion of people who are dead set, and in the U.S. context with weapons, that are not going to join, or be a part of justice movements. But the question is, how do you expand the possibility of the conversation? And I think that, if you look at what's happened in the U.S. Around policing, you can see that there's been, there's going to be a lot of research done over time about why this movement now, and of course it is tied to the pandemic itself, which laid bare all of the social and environmental and racial, vulnerabilities. And so the pandemic impacts why, the spark took now, and not with, the hundreds of police deaths that happen at any given time, But I think that, your point of what the solidarity does is that it has to be a practice, and it has to be done over time, and it can't just be, showing to a march and, that's the extent of what you do. It's about the building of relationships. It's about the analytic of understanding how these things are connected. And I think that right now we're in a remarkable moment where, the pandemic lays bare, these the analysis that justice movements have been making for a very long time. And there's a broader availability of people to understand and to start thinking within the realm of possibility. And, part of it is, probably because things are so, terrible, and the things with, and the problems of the US and the individualism and the lack of, healthcare and so on. And the question of vulnerability is a huge one in the US in terms of, COVID and, who isn't able to work from home and so on. And so I think there are lots of different connections that made that the justice critique make sense to more people. Mm-hmm. And so that's the moment that is, and also because of the state has basically withdrawn, public support in any kind of meaningful way. There are more networks of mutual solidarity, emerging. People are willing to be a part of them, than in time when it doesn't seem as dire. So, I think that's the fundamental condition that I try to talk about in the book, which is to have some clear-eyed sense of, the stakes of what we're in, and to not romanticize these moments, but to say, what justice movements and justice activists who work on this over the long term offer is a framework and a set of actionable, activities that you can do, in the moments when, the middle that isn't necessarily like a justice activist feels like, okay, well, this makes sense, and, I can do this thing now.
Yeah. Yeah, and also part of the aim seems to provide something that your book does, is to provide histories, alternative histories of crucial conflicts, so that precisely, when people then want to know why certain things today are as they are, they can refer to this stock of memories and histories that are not exactly mainstream. And this seems something very important that you try to do with your book. That is for younger generation, but also for old people that, as you say, in this specific moment become aware that things are not right, and seek explanations, and also for future reference. So in fact, in this regard, I wanted to ask you, as scholars in political ecology, environmental justice studies, or environmental humanities, how important is this work of building and preservation of narratives and histories and accounts that seems so crucial in this in your latest book?
Well, I wrote this book mostly because there is an incredible awareness of a lot of the struggles that I talk about in the book. So, you know, if chapter 1 talks about Standing Rock and Keystone Pipeline, chapter 2 talks about slow violence and fast violence through the lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, but also the set of environmental and social justice problems in the Central Valley region of California, which is where I live and work. So that includes things like, you know, water, access, pesticide, air. It's a lot of different problems in the Central Valley. And then the 3rd chapter talks about Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, and the idea of environmental disasters and crisis, but also that chapter is the one where I talk about radical hope and what culture making, you know, does in terms of rethinking the moment of danger. And so I talk about films like Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley and so on. And so it's a very short, synthetic book. And it's interesting because the older I get, the more I realize that there's a gap between, you know, who I am and the experiences I've been through and the things that frame my politics and my students. And so I used to have to explain environmental justice, and you'd have to show it and prove that it exists. Whereas now, a lot of the students, because of social media and other factors, or, you know, growing up with climate change, they have always known about and, you know, been concerned about climate change. They really know. You can just say Standing Rock, you know, you could say Flint, and they've heard of it. Very few of my students have not heard of these kinds of disasters. And so, you know, on the one hand, the students and the general public have an understanding of the problems, but what's sometimes lacking in the detail is the details, also the connections, and also, again, the historicity of these struggles. So yes, many people, not just students, many people know about Standing Rock. Many people know about you know, if a hurricane happens, and, you know, there's the unequal social and racial impacts of it. But, you know, I also found that Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005, which for me was an, you know, absolutely opening moment for the one we're in now. My students don't know about Hurricane Katrina. You know, they know about the 20 massive hurricanes that have happened since, and then they all kind of blend in, you know, to each other. And so what I wanted to do was to use all of the amazing writing and that has already happened about all of these struggles. And, you know, that ranges from more scholarly writing, but also more activist writing. So, you know, in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina happened, you didn't have things like these, like syllabi that, you know, now scholars put online, where they say, okay, well, you want to learn about Standing Rock. Well, the Standing Rock Coalition, which is Native and non-Native scholars, you know, created a bibliography for people, and, you know, over 1,000 pages online. You didn't have that. You couldn't have that because the internet, you know, that's not what people did, you know, back then. And so now there's an availability, but it's almost like an overwhelming amount of information. So what I try to do is just sort of synthesize it and create a short narrative, because it's actually incredibly hard to remember a lot of the details. You know, like, when did the actual, you know, conflict start, or what, you know. And so what I wanted to do was, for my own students and also for myself, collate and collect, you know, a lot of what has been written into a synthetic format that would be useful, and also to use keywords as a framing reference for them. So it's not just, you know, individualized, like, oh, well, you have Standing Rock here and Flint over here, as if they're disconnected in time and space. Because, you know, you had a lot of solidarity movements going in between, like there were Flint delegations that were sent to Standing Rock, you know, and then other Standing Rock folks who went, you know, go other places. And so on the ground, those connections are being made. And so I wanted to also keep track of those as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is amazing, and it's something that as a younger scholar, I also think it's a main task that I want to fulfill. That is precisely to show, to give a picture of different struggles and their connection, historicizing them and seeing them how they continue in the present, and inform. Continue to inform present struggle. But of course, there is a work of narrating this movement and remembering and putting order among the chaos of and the dump of information that we are subjected to. But coming back to your book, there is something that you also mentioned just now that I was intrigued, and is the emphasis on the radical hope in times of disaster. That you devote a chapter also to this. And I have to admit, I want to ask this because I personally have some issues with the concept of hope, because at times it seems to me a sort of a spiritual medication, something that people in despair are attached to, but that sometimes can cloud the awareness of the present. But but you make an argument for hope to be radical. So I wanted to ask you, how can hope be radical? And how also it can be translated, this radical hope, in action into contexts that seem hopeless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I struggle myself also with the thinking about hope uh, and how can we have hope now in this moment? And it's especially if you follow the science on climate change, it's very hard to have any sense of hope, and especially if you live in the U.S. and you care about climate change, with the climate, the attacks on climate, that come from the administration and so on. I mean, it's very and so in that chapter I talk about how hope is not naive, how to have a non-naive sense of hope. And to me, the non-naive sense of hope comes from understanding struggles that transcend any particular administration or the moment that we live in around austerity and neoliberalism. And so I think that the reason why I think having a non-naive radical hope is still important is because when you're around activists, especially indigenous and African American activists in the U.S., their time scale that they're talking about oftentimes is a very long time scale, and so I think the hopelessness that I sometimes feel and my students feel whenever I hear that or feel that, I think about my colleagues, who are activists, who are like, how can you give up? You can't, we've been fighting forever. We don't have the luxury of choosing this. Our existence itself is a struggle. You know what I mean? And so I think that, I hear those words and I hear the voices of activists that I work with that basically say, like, hopelessness is a privilege of the elite, or it's the privilege of people who can opt in or out of movements. And so the time scale that the people I work with, will jump between, sometimes go between talking about the moment now and the civil rights movement.
Hello?
Did it slow down? Is it okay now?
Yes, now I can hear you again. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that, what the idea of despair and hopelessness, is really a dangerous one too, because it also has a political function, to shut down action.
Yeah.
you know. And so whenever, you know, I start to sort of feel that, or my students feel that, again, you know, I hear the voices of the people I work with, you know, who said, we don't have, you know, we don't have the privilege of feeling this. You know, our existence was meant to not be, you know. And so that's part of what motivates my my thinking on that,
Yeah.
you know. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of hope as persistence, and as will to live despite all odds. Yeah, you know, very different from tradition of hope based on some help that will come. It's more hope based on our own resources and will to
Mhm.
to to rise against all odds.
Mhm.
And I also very much feel sympathetic to this notion, and I've seen this rising in also in other cases of environmental conflicts or social conflicts that I
Mhm.
have studied. Mm,
I
now,
mean, I think that
yeah,
the for indigenous people and the descendants of enslaved peoples in the U.S., you know, the survival itself is political. And you know, again, for indigenous peoples, you know, around the world, especially in settler states, you know, in Brazil, you know, there would be nothing better for, you know, Bolsonaro if the, you know, indigenous people did not exist, so resources could be extracted,
yeah,
and capitalism can thrive. So I think the idea of, you know, survival as resistance, you know, that it's a very important one, especially from an indigenous standpoint, you know. So in a non-naive way of romanticizing indigenous lives and cultures, I'm not saying that, you know, there's, I'm not, you know, falling into that kind of romanticized trope, but you know, when the Standing Rock Sioux refused to take, you know, the money for the land, you know, over time, that it's accrued over to billions of dollars, you know, to say that, you know, land is not worth money, you know, that's an incredibly powerful um, uh, political choice, you know,
yeah,
and it's an ideological one. It's saying that this is, you cannot reduce this to capitalist ways of understanding. This is not, you can give us 10, you know, it's gone with interest to billions of dollars, you know, and this is not, you know, a wealthy reservation that lives off of, you know, casino money or so on. I mean, taking the billions of dollars would mean material changes in, you know, people's lives, but that, you know, over decades have refused that. You know, I mean, I think that that's a really powerful reminder that, you know, we cannot reduce land to, you know, money, and
yeah.
that's an important, that's, I think, really important.
Yes, yes, is fundamental because in a sense it also says that our lives cannot be separated from the land, and our lives are not for sale. And the
Right.
lives, and culture, and land is like something that you cannot divide or give a price tag to.
Right.
And this seems, you know, the relevance of this seems also growing with the growing dangers we're facing, because I mean, an issue like climate change is putting pressure all over the world now to, you know, how do we value life, which lives do we value, and are we ready to accept small gains in the short term compared to destruction in the very long term. So it's more relevant than ever, and in relation to also the issue of culture, another fil rouge, another thread running through your book is the importance of environmental justice as culture making. That to me sounds a very original take also on the issue of environmental justice, because it seems to relate to the work of connections we were talking about before. So particularly in the building of a new common sense through material and virtual spaces of cultural production. But also it seems to me it points to something more profound, to cultural work and culture making as an attempt at transforming subjectivities through new symbolic references that are both experienced but also directly participated into. So I wanted to ask you, how and where do you see a culture, and which kind of culture is emerging from environmental justice struggles and movements?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of different forms of culture making, and so I there's lots of different examples, and from the more traditional sense of cultural production, poetry, um, TV narratives, to film, and the but there's also the culture making, which of course has a longer tradition in sort of radical printmaking and so on. And I think that that's very generationally specific. And it goes back to what I was saying before about, the availability of the analysis for the younger generations. There's so much work that exists on graphically and on Instagram and different social media contexts. And so the availability, again, for a radical politics for younger people they come into, for me at least, I see, the university, they're coming in more aware. Like, you have to do less convincing, about the set of problems. And so you have to kind of adjust that. And I say this now because, my daughter is Gen Z and, entering university, and, there's a critique of it too, that activism can't just be via Instagram and so on. And that is true. But what I do think is remarkable is that, for more of the younger generation, again, the availability of the critique, is there, a lot of it through the visual culture that exists online and through social media. I'm really impacted by the work of, in the US, this group called Movement Generation, and they are a very intersectional, culture-based movement, and they were impacted by Hurricane Katrina, but based in the Bay Area. So they're really focused on making radical connections and thinking about radical politics through culture making. And so they've been really interesting because they're using, again, social media in a shorter formats to talk about their ideologies. And so they have this online web series called The North Pole, which links climate change and gentrification and wildfires and, sort of big ticket issues. But each episode is only 7 minutes long. And so I think that the genres that are emerging now are also, generationally and technologically, specific. And I think that is, that's a really good example too, of where the culture making, looks like now, and for a climate justice and an environmental justice, generation. It's things like, 30-second videos, or, this North Pole series, which I really, recommend to people, which is like 7-minute episodes and so on. And so, that's one form of, like, culture making in the sense of, like, this cultural product, what it looks like. But I think, culture, it's also about, the sensibility, itself being normalized, through meme culture and so on. So I think you can see it all around you. And for me, it's trying to understand, where the students are, they're coming in differently, in some ways. But, again, not to, oversimplify a generational analysis too, but, the other thing is that for younger people, this goes back to what you were saying about, being an older or living through your career, or trying to understand the moment. The younger generation have only lived under austerity and neoliberalism. And, in the US, there's I think less of an organized, critique of austerity and neoliberalism for many young people. And I think, you know, that's also changing, of course, because of what's happening now. But I think that, you know, what I try to do in my teaching and also in this book is to say that, you know, this thing that you think is normal, you know, even saying the internet, you know, as the primary way that we get information or, you know, understand the world, you know, that's not that old. None of this is that old, you know. And so that's what I try to do, you know, in the book and also in my teaching is to, you know, understand where students are at, or, you know, people in general, you know, but to, this is where, you know, why I'm always, you know, very influenced by, you know, Gramsci and, you know, his, you know, ideas of hegemony and so
Yeah.
on. So, and that's why, you know, my friend says, you're like Gramsci's girlfriend. You know, you love Gramsci. And I'm like, well, that's fine. I'm okay with that. You know what I mean? And so, you know, his ideas I think are really useful for understanding, you know, as a guidepost of, for me to understand, you know, what's happening in the world and, you know, what you can do as a scholar or how other people's norms have been shaped by, you know, the prevailing technologies and politics that they've grown up with.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I feel this is something very important that we should pursue as scholars. So be in touch with our times, especially by working with activists and social movements that are not shy to use all the possible and available tools, so that the message multiplies. In particular, I'm thinking also how the new technologies are changing the media scape, because right now with just a small scale organization, a social movement can have its own broadcast and its own flow of news and information that of course do not have all the visibility of big media, but they can break through social media platforms and become reference point. So this forces us also to change our register when we want to participate in debates, and so use this kind of media and understand what are they producing. So very very relevant, and I'm gonna check out the North Pole miniseries. So another thing I wanted to ask you, that going a bit beyond the book. So in this moment of in which climate breakdown is increasing and becoming more and more visible and threatening, it seems mitigation efforts, especially in US, it's the best example, seem to be less and less on the top of the agenda of governments, and also projects of adaptation that we see currently being rolled out also seem to overlook the needs of the most vulnerable and disenfranchised. And I'm thinking, for example, to New York City, where billions are spent in adaptation projects, but without clear benefits for the most vulnerable population. So in this context, I'm thinking, and this is also part of the research I'm doing right now, what environmental movements and especially environmental justice movement, which role can they play, not just in steering climate action at several levels, from lobbying to actually blocking and occupying infrastructure, but also in the task of self-organizing, adaptation, or preparing to disaster in other ways, as we already saw something happening in post-Sandy context and even post-Katrina context. So do you think grassroots organizations working on environmental justice have a role to play in self-organizing adaptation?
Yes, I mean, of course, they have a role to play, and I think, you know, they do play that role, or they're really, you know, trying to shape what that looks like, whether it's from a more local standpoint, you know, in particular places, to pushing for legislation at different scales, whether that's, you know, across New York City, or thinking about, you know, what a Green New Deal, you know, would look like, and you know, I mean, it's you know, there's a whole Green New Deal agenda, you know, in the U.S. And so I think that the I haven't read yet, but I'm going. I think that people on this call, should read the work of Ashley Dawson, and he has a new book, on public power and thinking about, how the work of that doesn't seem like climate work, is also climate justice work, and so thinking about housing and free public transportation, and some of that is also globally inflected. So, the work of Daniel Aldana Cohen looks at worker movements in Brazil and thinking about, these struggles as also climate justice, even though they might not seem to be, at first, obviously, climate justice struggles, but thinking about, the struggles for time, space, the thinking about housing and transportation and the other forms of, other things that look like issues, but not thinking of them as sort of just technical issues that can be overcome, but really just fundamentally as public infrastructure that's being, taken away from people. I think what the pandemic does is kind of blow out the arguments, especially the economic ones, and so after the first bailout in the U.S., it was like multi-trillion dollars to, bail out large corporate, interests. And so, the idea of there's no money for this, that the pandemic kind of blows out that argument, saying, well, you know what, you found multi-trillion dollars, to bail out, economies in this moment. So, that argument, was always never true, but it became like more clearly evidenced, that was never what that was about, and so again, that goes back to the dynamic or the tension that I was talking about the moment. Like there's the danger, but then there's the opportunity in that, more people are like, these corporations got bailouts, and then, we're still fighting over, $600 a week to, and we lose our health insurance. These are all US, specific problems, but the pandemic really just lays that bare, but particularly in the economic sphere. So I think climate justice organizations have always tried to have always worked on a multi-scalar level, thinking about what this looks like locally, but then also working in regions or in broader coalitions. And so, that those things can happen, simultaneously, and they happen all the time, and simultaneously. So yes, climate justice has a role to play in climate adaptation, and it has a role to play in, pushing for just transition. And that's what they've been doing, in many different places, in the US, but also globally. So
yeah, I agree. Also that I actually see it as movements that are mobilizing around environmental and climatic issue also are building the networks that can be activated when disaster strikes. And I'm looking at Sweden right now. And in Malmo, you can clearly see that some movements that are focused, like Extinction Rebellion, just on mitigation, do not have the same organizational capacity of other movements that have been years working on issues of housing, social discrimination, support to refugees. It seems that actually they have more resources to mobilize in case something happens. So the one attempt as a scholar activist I'm trying to do, it's also to make them communicate and show how these different groups can work together. And this is also a theoretical work of showing the connections and make them explicit. I wanted to ask you a last thing. This is something I keep on thinking and reflecting together with many colleagues. And actually, your way of it's about what we as academics have to say and to do in these dangerous moments, and what's our position. And I must say, your way of working has been also inspiring me for being at the crossroad of active politics and academia. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that we as academics now, in this specific moment in which contradictions are exploding, should be less shy about our political role, and also explicitly coming up and supporting actions and ideas that basically counteract the deadly trajectory of current mainstream culture and economy? Like, is it time to really abandon once and for all this pretense of objectivity or neutrality that is often attached to academia?
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, of course, there's, people have to answer that question based on their own positionality, and I think it's different for people who are working in precarious, context. And so, but certainly anybody who has tenure and who has security, should be, I've always thought that they should be doing, what they can, because, we're incredibly privileged to be able to, think and write and teach. That's a gift of time. And so, I mean, I think different people will answer that question. But again, like what I was saying before about, the moment, you rise up to the moment that you're in. And so there are more people, and I'm incredibly, I'm also incredibly impacted by my students and also junior scholars who, are very explicitly political, and, work and make demands and press institutions in ways that I cannot imagine having done so as an undergraduate student or as a, starting researcher. And, I've always been working with social movements. And so it wasn't that I was an apolitical person, but I think, for me, it's been interesting to watch, whether it's around gender, or around race, but the sexual, the backlash against, the norms of sexual discrimination, and sort of, the ways that people kind of swallowed up racial, insults, and, you didn't want to make things public. This generation doesn't take that anymore. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that that's something that, I watch, and I'm in amazement, this is where I feel very much like, okay, you have to not just, go along with things, but, I sit and I really am impressed, and I think that the important part for people is to not, feel compelled to, but like to take things seriously, and, to understand, like, okay, well, where does this thing come from? And, especially as a left scholar, to think and not be reactive, when things are challenging to you. So, so for me, thinking about, okay, well, this is not something that I understood or I grew up with, like gender pronouns, or thinking about, that is an issue, but that we have a responsibility to ourselves as scholars, again, to understand the moments and the movements that are happening, and so, and that isn't a reflexive, like, you just go with everything that's happening, or now there's a debate against that, and, there's a way in which it gets made too easy, like, oh, this is about, shaming people or so on. And I don't think it's about shaming. I think a lot of this is about accountability. And, this is the other side of, the social media, is that the norms are changing all the time. And so the question is, you have to think about, what is the norm that's being challenged, and where do you stand on the moment? And not necessarily, again, in an easy way, but in an analytic way. And then once you make that decision, you just make sustained, like, okay, I didn't understand this. Now I understand the history of this thing, or I understand the political stakes, and that's it. Now I understand it. I'm on board. I agree, and this is aligned with this other thing that I've been trying to build and support for many years. And, these are not, competitive things, that they're all tied to the same struggles. And that's why, it's thinking about, justice movements together, is so important, whether it's like, okay, reproductive justice, climate justice, racial justice. If you think of health justice, if you think of what the justice movements, are all trying to accomplish, then you won't get into some sort of, like crabs in a barrel fight over scarce resources. And, this goes back to why I think environmental justice movements are so useful, because they always resisted that kind of like cleaving off of issues as separate from each other, like, that economic was separate from racial, was separate from environmental, that, air was separate from water, which was separate from pesticides, which was separate from pollution. And so I think that the moment we're in is really showing that, that idea of like things being connected, is so available. And so that's the moment we have to, rise to. But if you get into a defensive sphere and say, oh, okay, well, everybody's working on police brutality, and what about this? I mean, that's not what, scholars, that's not what activists on the ground are thinking. You know what I mean? And so why should we get defensive? You know what I mean? I think it's, as scholars, we have the opportunity, to think, and then to make decisions about how we want to spend, our thinking time, speaking time, teaching time,
Yeah, and those are definitely all political decisions as well, especially when there is not much time left. Yes. in many ways. Okay, I feel I exhausted my questions and feel really enriched by this conversation. So is there anything you want to add, or we could also finish?
No, it's been great, and so I'm really appreciate, the time that you have taken, to do this. And I'm sorry again that, I couldn't be live on it, but I'm glad we were able to work it out. So thank you.
No, thank you very much for being available. And this will now is recorded and will be up tomorrow, or today for our listeners. Thank you very much, Julie.
Bye.
We talk. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.